The autumn sun was setting over the small Georgia town as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the police barricade. The local officers, who had been chatting among themselves, straightened up as Special Agent Andrea Chen stepped out of the vehicle. Her FBI windbreaker caught the last rays of sunlight, the golden badge gleaming against the dark fabric. She'd made this entrance hundreds of times before at crime scenes across the country, but something about this town's atmosphere made her pause for just a moment longer than usual. The crime scene sprawled across an old warehouse district, yellow tape fluttering in the evening breeze. Andrea had driven 3 hours from the Atlanta field office after getting the call. What had started as a local investigation had quickly revealed patterns matching a string of federal cases, bringing her here to this quiet town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, except her. Taking in the scene with practiced eyes, she noticed how the local officers' gazes followed her movements. 12 years with the Bureau had taught her to read rooms like this one. Some faces showed curiosity, others uncertainty, and a few displayed that all too familiar look of judgment she learned to expect as one of the few Asian American women in her position. "Evening, gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. She pulled out her credentials, the leather wallet worn smooth from years of use. The nearest officer, a younger man with kind eyes, stepped forward to check them. His name tag read Officer Reynolds, and his hands trembled slightly as he examined her ID, probably his first time working with the FBI. Behind Reynolds, Andrea spotted a cluster of senior officers huddled near the warehouse entrance. One of them, wearing sergeant stripes and a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his weather-beaten face, was already shaking his head before she'd taken 2 steps toward them. She'd seen that look before, the one that said, "You don't belong here." As she approached the group, she pulled out her notebook, already flipping to the case notes she'd reviewed during her drive. The facts ran through her mind. 3 similar cases in neighboring counties, all showing the same peculiar evidence pattern that had triggered federal involvement. But before she could speak, the sergeant turned his back to her, addressing his questions to Officer Reynolds instead. "This the Fed they sent us?" he asked, as if Andrea wasn't standing right there. His voice carried the kind of forced casualness that made everyone within earshot uncomfortable. A few officers shifted their weight, eyes darting between their sergeant and the FBI agent. The tension in the air thickened like storm clouds gathering before rain. Andrea felt the familiar weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She'd worked too hard and come too far to let old prejudices derail this investigation. Lives could depend on how she handled the next few minutes. Taking a deep breath, she thought of her father's words from years ago. "Sometimes the strongest response is simply doing your job better than anyone else can." She cleared her throat and stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel. The case file in her hand held more than just evidence. It held 12 years of experience, countless solved cases, and the weight of every barrier she'd already broken through. The next words out of her mouth would set the tone for the entire investigation, and she knew exactly what they needed to be. The warehouse loomed behind them, its shadows growing longer as day faded into dusk. Whatever waited inside that building would require all of them working together, whether the sergeant liked it or not. Andrea had learned long ago that the best way to change minds wasn't through confrontation, but through undeniable competence. As she opened the case file, she could feel all eyes on her, waiting to see what this FBI agent would do next. The tension at the crime scene could have been cut with a knife as Sergeant Brooks, that was the name on his badge, continued to speak over Andrea's head. He turned to Officer Thompson, Andrea's younger colleague who had arrived separately, directing all his questions about the federal investigation to him instead. "So what's the Bureau's interest in our case?" Brooks asked Thompson, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Thompson, to his credit, glanced uncertainly at Andrea, knowing full well she was the lead agent on the case. "Actually, sir," Thompson began, clearing his throat, "Special Agent Chen is the—" "I asked you, son," Brooks interrupted, his voice carrying that fake friendliness that made everyone within earshot shift uncomfortably. The other officers nearby pretended to be busy with their notepads or radio calls, but their attention was fixed on the unfolding scene. Andrea maintained her professional composure, though she could feel her heart beating faster. She dealt with this kind of treatment throughout her career. In the academy, during her early days as a field agent, and even now as a senior investigator. Each time, she learned to handle it better than the last. "Sergeant Brooks," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I can share the details of our investigation directly. We've identified similar patterns in 3 other cases across state lines." She pulled out her tablet, displaying a map with red pins marking each location. The evidence suggests we're dealing with the same perpetrator. Brooks barely glanced at the screen. "Listen, honey," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We've been working these streets for 20 years. We don't need some quota hire from Washington telling us how to do our jobs." The air seemed to freeze. Even the radio chatter in the background went quiet. Several younger officers looked down at their boots, while others watched with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. Thompson's face had gone red with embarrassment and anger on Andrea's behalf. But Andrea had been preparing for moments like this her entire career. She remembered the advice her mentor had given her years ago. Your work speaks louder than their words. She took a slow, deliberate breath and opened her briefcase. "Sergeant," she said, maintaining eye contact, "I understand your concern about outside interference, but right now, there's a criminal out there who has already hurt people in 4 different jurisdictions. Every minute we spend questioning each other's qualifications is a minute they can use to plan their next move." She laid out 4 case files on the hood of the nearest patrol car. These files contain detailed forensic analysis linking all 4 crimes. I've personally interviewed witnesses in Atlanta and Memphis who've provided consistent descriptions. The FBI lab has confirmed matching DNA evidence at 3 scenes. Her voice remained professional, but took on a trace of steel as she continued. "Now, we can either work together to catch this person, or we can waste time trying to figure out who belongs here. What's your choice, Sergeant?" The growing darkness around them was broken by the harsh glare of crime scene lights flickering to life. In their stark white glow, several officers had moved closer, listening intently. Officer Reynolds, the young cop who'd first checked her credentials, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, respectfully but firmly, "I'd like to brief you on what we found inside the warehouse. Some of it matches what you just described from the other scenes." It was a small gesture, but a significant one. One by one, other officers began approaching with their notepads, ready to share information. Brooks stood there, his face a mix of emotions he was trying hard to control. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through pure professionalism and undeniable expertise. Andrea nodded to Reynolds, pulling out her own notebook. "Thank you, officer. Let's start with the point of entry." She looked around at the gathered officers, including them all in her gaze. "Every detail matters in this case. You've been working this scene. Tell me what you've observed." As the officers began sharing their findings, Andrea could feel the initial resistance melting away. Not completely. Change never happens that quickly, but enough to get the job done. And right now, that's what mattered most. Finding the person responsible before they could strike again. The tension of the crime scene could have been cut with a knife as Sergeant Brooks, that was the name on his badge, continued to speak over Andrea's head. He turned to Officer Thompson, Andrea's younger colleague who had arrived separately, directing all his questions about the federal investigation to him instead. "So what's the Bureau's interest in our case?" Brooks asked Thompson, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Thompson, to his credit, glanced uncertainly at Andrea, knowing full well she was the lead agent on the case. "Actually, sir," Thompson began, clearing his throat, "Special Agent Chen is the—" "I asked you, son," Brooks interrupted, his voice carrying that fake friendliness that made everyone within earshot shift uncomfortably. The other officers nearby pretended to be busy with their notepads or radio calls, but their attention was fixed on the unfolding scene. Andrea maintained her professional composure, though she could feel her heart beating faster. She dealt with this kind of treatment throughout her career. In the academy, during her early days as a field agent, and even now as a senior investigator. Each time, she learned to handle it better than the last. "Sergeant Brooks," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I can share the details of our investigation directly. We've identified similar patterns in 3 other cases across state lines." She pulled out her tablet, displaying a map with red pins marking each location. The evidence suggests we're dealing with the same perpetrator. Brooks barely glanced at the screen. "Listen, honey," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We've been working these streets for 20 years. We don't need some quota hire from Washington telling us how to do our jobs." The air seemed to freeze. Even the radio chatter in the background went quiet. Several younger officers looked down at their boots, while others watched with wide eyes, waiting to see what would happen next. Thompson's face had gone red with embarrassment and anger on Andrea's behalf. But Andrea had been preparing for moments like this her entire career. She remembered the advice her mentor had given her years ago. Your work speaks louder than their words. She took a slow, deliberate breath and opened her briefcase. "Sergeant," she said, maintaining eye contact, "I understand your concern about outside interference, but right now, there's a criminal out there who has already hurt people in 4 different jurisdictions. Every minute we spend questioning each other's qualifications is a minute they can use to plan their next move." She laid out 4 case files on the hood of the nearest patrol car. These files contain detailed forensic analysis linking all 4 crimes. I've personally interviewed witnesses in Atlanta and Memphis who've provided consistent descriptions. The FBI lab has confirmed matching DNA evidence at 3 scenes. Her voice remained professional, but took on a trace of steel as she continued. "Now we can either work together to catch this person, or we can waste time trying to figure out who belongs here. What's your choice, Sergeant?" The growing darkness around them was broken by the harsh glare of crime scene lights flickering to life. In their stark white glow, several officers had moved closer, listening intently. Officer Reynolds, the young cop who'd first checked her credentials, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, respectfully but firmly, "I'd like to brief you on what we found inside the warehouse. Some of it matches what you just described from the other scenes." It was a small gesture, but a significant one. One by one, other officers began approaching with their notepads, ready to share information. Brooks stood there, his face a mix of emotions he was trying hard to control. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through pure professionalism and undeniable expertise. Andrea nodded to Reynolds, pulling out her own notebook. "Thank you, officer. Let's start with the point of entry." She looked around at the gathered officers, including them all in her gaze. "Every detail matters in this case. You've been working this scene. Tell me what you've observed." As the officers began sharing their findings, Andrea could feel the initial resistance melting away. Not completely. Change never happens that quickly, but enough to get the job done. And right now, that's what mattered most. Finding the person responsible before they could strike again. The next morning, fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the crowded briefing room of the local police station. Coffee cups littered the tables, and the air was thick with tension as Andrea prepared to present her analysis. Officers filled every chair, some standing against the walls, while Brooks sat in the front row, arms crossed. The projector flickered to life, displaying a map with red pins marking each crime scene. Andrea had spent half the night connecting the dots, and now everything pointed to a pattern that couldn't be ignored. But just as she began speaking, Brooks cleared his throat loudly. "Before we waste everyone's time," he announced, pushing his chair back with a screech, "I think we should discuss how these kinds of high-profile cases are assigned." His eyes swept the room, seeking support. "Seems to me the Bureau's sending people based on some interesting criteria these days. The room fell silent. Even the usual whispers and coffee cup shuffling stopped. Andrea's hand froze mid-gesture at the map, years of similar moments flashing through her mind. She could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting to see how she'd handle this direct challenge. Officer Reynolds, sitting near the back, shook his head in disappointment. Chief Richardson, who had been reviewing some papers, looked up sharply. But before either could speak, Andrea calmly walked to her laptop and pulled up a different file. "Actually, Sergeant Brooks, let's discuss criteria," she said, her voice steady. The screen behind her changed to display a new set of images. "This is the Chen Rodriguez analysis method for tracking interstate crime patterns. It's now used by 17 FBI field offices." She clicked again. "These are the results from the Memphis case last year, solved in 48 hours using this technique." Another click showed newspaper headlines about solved cases. "Here are the 3 trafficking rings we shut down using this approach." She turned to face Brooks directly. "And this," she said, pulling up one final slide, "is the commendation from the director after we caught the Highway 20 killer using the same method." The room was absolutely still. Brooks's face had gone from smug to stunned as he realized his attempt to undermine her had backfired spectacularly. But Andrea wasn't finished. "Now, Sergeant," she continued, her tone professional but firm, "you mentioned criteria. Let's talk about the criteria that matter: solve rates, conviction rates, and lives saved. Because that's why we're all here, isn't it? Not to prove who belongs where, but to catch criminals and protect people." She turned to the whole room. "Yesterday's witness gave us crucial new evidence. The blue van had a custom plate frame from a dealership in Riverside, the same dealership where our suspect worked briefly in 2021. She clicked back to the map. "Every single crime scene is within a 3-hour drive of that location." Officer Chen, a young patrol officer who had been quietly taking notes, suddenly spoke up. "Wait, my cousin works at that dealership. I can get employee records from that time period. And I know those back roads well," another officer added. "There are only a few routes they could have taken without hitting traffic cameras." The energy in the room shifted as officers began calling out connections and ideas. Even some of Brooks's usual supporters were leaning forward, engaged in the investigation rather than the politics. The case was coming together, piece by piece, through real cooperation. Chief Richardson stood up. "Agent Chen, I think we need to set up a command center. This could be our chance to catch them before they hit another location." He paused, looking directly at Brooks. "And I expect every officer to give their full cooperation. This isn't about badges or backgrounds. It's about doing our job." Brooks sat there, his earlier bravado deflated, as officers around him nodded in agreement. Andrea could see him processing the moment, perhaps realizing that his prejudices had nearly compromised the investigation. She didn't need him to like her. She just needed him to work with her. "Let's take a 15-minute break," she suggested, "and then we'll divide into teams. Every person in this room has something valuable to contribute. Let's use that to catch these criminals." As people filed out for coffee, several officers stopped to share their insights with Andrea. The wall of resistance was crumbling, not because of confrontation, but because competence and results spoke louder than any prejudice. The county fair lights twinkled in the evening sky, casting colorful shadows across the packed parking lots. Andrea sat in an unmarked car, radio quietly crackling with updates from various teams positioned around the grounds. Next to her, Brooks checked his weapon for the 3rd time, a habit born from years of experience. "Team 2 in position," came Officer Reynolds' voice over the radio. "Nothing unusual near the south entrance." "Copy that," Andrea responded, then turned to Brooks. "Your people know these grounds better than anyone. If you were going to hit one of those warehouses, which route would you take?" Brooks studied the tablet showing the surveillance feeds. "There's an access road behind the Ferris wheel," he said, pointing. "Maintenance vehicles use it during the fair. Perfect cover for a van that's not supposed to be there." Just then, Officer Chen's voice crackled through. Possible match on the van. Moving north on Parker Street. Blue Ford. Partial plate visible. Andrea sat up straighter, her heart beating faster. Months of investigation could come down to the next few minutes. She glanced at Brooks, who was already reaching for his radio. "All units maintain positions," he ordered, his voice steady. "Let's not spook them before they commit." He looked at Andrea, adding, "Your call on when we move." The trust in that simple statement spoke volumes about how far they'd come in the past 2 days. Andrea nodded, keeping her eyes on the tablet as multiple cameras tracked the van's progress. "They're taking the maintenance road," Officer Chen reported. "Just like you said, Sergeant." The fair crowd's distant laughter and music created an odd backdrop to the tension in their car. Andrea watched as the van slowed near one of the warehouses, its headlights switching off. "All units, stand by," she said quietly into the radio. "Wait for my signal." Through the cameras, they could see 2 figures emerging from the van, moving with the practiced efficiency they'd seen in security footage from the other crimes. Brooks's hand tightened on his door handle, but he waited, following Andrea's lead. "They're picking the lock," came Thompson's whisper over the radio. "Just like the other scenes." Andrea keyed her radio. "All units, move in. Remember, we want them inside. Clean takedown, by the book." What happened next was a testament to perfect coordination. Local officers and FBI agents moved as one unit, their months of friction dissolved in the heat of action. The warehouse doors clattered shut behind the suspects, and then, "FBI. Police. Drop your weapons." The shouts echoed through the night, followed by the thunder of footsteps. Andrea and Brooks burst in through the side entrance, flashlights cutting through darkness. The suspects, caught in the act of breaking into a shipping container, froze in the sudden glare. "Hands where we can see them," Brooks commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The takedown was textbook perfect. Within minutes, the suspects were in custody, their tools scattered across the warehouse floor. As Officer Reynolds read them their rights, Andrea noticed something that made her smile. Local officers and federal agents working seamlessly together, processing the scene as if they'd been partners for years. Chief Richardson arrived just as they were loading the suspects into patrol cars. "Impressive work," he said, looking between Andrea and Brooks. "Both of you. This is how it's supposed to work." Brooks turned to Andrea, awkwardly clearing his throat. "That analysis of yours," he said, "about the pattern near their old workplaces, we would have missed it without that." "Good call." "And we never would have known about that maintenance road without your local knowledge," Andrea replied. "Sometimes it takes different perspectives to see the whole picture." As the adrenaline of the arrest faded, the fair's music drifted back into focus. Families were still enjoying their evening, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Officer Chen approached with evidence bags containing documents from the van. Paperwork that would link these suspects to all the other crimes. "You know," Brooks said quietly, watching the suspects being driven away, "I had this idea about federal agents coming in and taking over. Never thought about what they might bring to the table." Andrea smiled. "And I've learned that local knowledge isn't just about knowing the streets. It's about understanding the community." The night ended with an impromptu gathering at the station. Local officers and federal agents sharing coffee and trading stories about the case. The walls that had seemed so solid just days ago had crumbled, replaced by something stronger. Mutual respect, earned through action rather than assumed through rank or role. The morning after the arrest, the station buzzed with a different kind of energy. News crews gathered outside, eager to cover the break in the interstate crime spree. Inside, Andrea sat at a desk reviewing evidence photos, while officers moved around her with a new sense of camaraderie. "The press conference is scheduled for noon," Chief Richardson announced, setting down a fresh cup of coffee on Andrea's desk. "They're going to want to know how we cracked the case." Before Andrea could respond, Brooks walked in carrying a thick folder. "Just got the full background check on our suspects," he said, placing it on the desk. "You won't believe this. They worked at 7 different dealerships across 3 states. Each robbery happened within months of them leaving. The change in Brooks's demeanor was striking. Gone was the hostile sergeant who tried to exclude her from witness interviews. In his place stood a professional who'd learned to value expertise over prejudice. Officer Reynolds rushed in, excitement clear on his face. The FBI lab just confirmed it. The tool marks from our warehouse match all the other scenes. We got them dead to rights. Andrea smiled, remembering how just days ago, these same officers had barely acknowledged her presence. Now they were sharing victories as a team. She opened the case file, spreading out photos from each crime scene. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to similar marks on different locks. Each location, they used the same technique, but they got sloppy at our warehouse because they thought the fair would keep us distracted. That was some quick thinking, Brooks admitted, pulling up a chair, using their own assumption of police distraction against them. He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Guess they didn't count on federal and local law enforcement actually working together." Chief Richardson gathered everyone around. "The DA's office just called. They want statements from all of us, local and federal, to show the cooperation that broke this case. They're calling it a model for interagency teamwork." Officer Chen, who had been quietly typing at his computer, spoke up. "You should see the internal bulletin boards, Agent Chen. Other departments are asking how we coordinated so effectively. They want to know our secret." The secret. Andrea looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. The secret was putting aside our preconceptions and trusting each other's strengths. Local knowledge, federal resources, and personal experience. We needed all of it. Brooks nodded slowly. "You know, I've been on the force for 20 years. Thought I knew everything about police work. But watching you piece together those patterns, connect those dots, it taught me something. Sometimes the best lessons come from where you least expect them." The room fell quiet, everyone sensing the weight of his words. It wasn't just about solving the case anymore. It was about breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. "I got something else," Officer Reynolds called out, waving a paper. "Remember that cold case from last year, the one that matched our pattern?" 2 witnesses just came forward after seeing the news. They're ready to talk. Andrea watched as Brooks immediately started organizing interview teams, naturally pairing local officers with federal agents. The transformation wasn't just in him. It was throughout the department. Chief Richardson cleared his throat. "Agent Chen, before the press conference, I'd like you to know that we've started revising our training protocols. Your approach to this case, how you handled everything, it's shown us a better way forward." The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the badges on their uniforms, local and federal, different shapes and designs, but all standing for the same principles of justice and service. "You know what impressed me most?" Brooks said suddenly, looking up from his paperwork. "Not just solving the case, but how you handled everything else. The whole time I was, well, being difficult, you kept your focus on what mattered, catching the bad guys and protecting people." Andrea smiled. "That's what it's always been about. Not badges or backgrounds, just doing the job right." Outside, they could hear the press gathering, cameras being set up. But in here, in this moment, it wasn't about headlines or credit. It was about a group of law enforcement officers who had learned to see past their differences to find something more important. The strength that comes from working together. 2 weeks after the arrests, Andrea returned to the small-town police station for one final visit. The place looked different now, not physically, but in the way people moved and worked together. New bulletin boards displayed both FBI and local police notices side by side, and officers gathered around them, discussing cases without regard for which agency had posted them. As she walked through the door, Officer Chen looked up from his desk with a bright smile. "Agent Chen, you're just in time. The DA just called. Both suspects agreed to plea deals. They're going away for a long time." "That's not all," Reynolds added, hurrying over with a tablet. Remember those cold cases we linked to them? 3 more departments found matches. This could clear up dozens of unsolved robberies across the state. Andrea noticed how the young officers now spoke with more confidence, no longer hesitating to share their insights. The change was particularly visible in the way they carried themselves. Proud but not arrogant, confident but still eager to learn. Chief Richardson emerged from his office, a stack of papers in his hand. "Perfect timing," he said warmly. "I was hoping to catch you before you headed back to Atlanta. We just finished implementing those new training procedures we discussed." He laid out the documents on a nearby desk. The title read Interagency Cooperation Guidelines, and Andrea could see her case analysis method referenced throughout the pages. "We're already seeing results," the chief continued. "Last week, we had a case that crossed county lines. Instead of the usual territory disputes, our officers immediately reached out to coordinate with the neighboring department. Brooks walked in then, and the change in him was perhaps the most striking of all. Gone was the defensive stance, the challenging glare. Instead, he carried himself with a different kind of confidence, one born of growth rather than presumption. "Agent Chen," he called out, "glad I caught you." He placed a framed newspaper article on the desk. The headline read, "Local Federal Cooperation Leads to Major Crime Ring Bust." But it wasn't the headline that caught Andrea's attention. It was the photo beneath it, showing local officers and federal agents working side by side at the crime scene. "We're putting this up in the briefing room," Brooks explained. "Reminder to everyone about what we can achieve when we work together." He paused, then added quietly, "And a reminder to check our assumptions at the door." Officer Reynolds approached with more news. "You inspired some changes around here," he said. 3 of our younger officers just applied to advanced training programs. They said watching you work showed them what's possible when you push past old boundaries." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, creating long shadows across the station floor. Andrea could hear the usual bustle of police work, phones ringing, radios crackling, officers discussing cases. But the tone was different now, more inclusive, more collaborative. "Before you go," Chief Richardson said, "there's something else." He handed her a letter. "The police academy wants you to come speak to their next class, not just about the case, but about breaking down barriers in law enforcement." Brooks nodded. "Those future officers need to hear this story," he said, "not just about catching the bad guys, but about how real change happens, one person, one decision at a time." As Andrea prepared to leave, officers gathered to say goodbye. Each one had a story to share, about cases they were approaching differently now, about reaching out to other departments, about seeing their job in a new light. "You know," Brooks said, walking her to her car, "I used to think change was something that happened to other people. But watching you these past weeks, you showed us it's something we choose, every day, in how we treat each other and do our jobs." Andrea looked back at the station one last time. Through the windows, she could see officers gathered around a desk, probably discussing their next case. Local and federal, veteran and rookie, all focused on what mattered most, serving and protecting their community. "The real change," she replied, "wasn't in proving anyone right or wrong. It was in showing that we're all on the same side." As she drove away, Andrea smiled, thinking about how sometimes the biggest victories aren't just in solving cases, but in changing hearts and minds, one small-town police station at a time. 6 months later, Andrea stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium, facing a room full of eager faces. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating young cadets in their crisp uniforms, all watching intently as she prepared to speak. "When I first arrived at that small-town police station," she began, "I wasn't just an FBI agent walking into a local case. I was walking into decades of assumptions, prejudices, and old ways of thinking. But what happened next changed not just one department, but became a model for police forces across the state." In the back of the room, she spotted familiar faces, Chief Richardson, Officer Reynolds, and even Brooks, who had driven 2 hours to be there. They hadn't come just to support her. They'd come to share their part of the story too. Look around this room, Andrea continued, gesturing to the diverse group of cadets. Each of you brings something unique to law enforcement. Your backgrounds, experiences, perspectives, these aren't obstacles to overcome. They're tools that make us all stronger. A young cadet raised her hand. But how did you handle it when people didn't want to accept your authority? Before Andrea could answer, Brooks stood up. Mind if I take that one? He asked, walking to the front. The room went quiet, everyone sensing something important was about to happen. 6 months ago, I was that person, Brooks admitted, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I saw an FBI agent who didn't fit my image of what authority should look like. And you know what? I was wrong. Dead wrong. Agent Chen didn't just solve our case. She showed us a better way to be police officers. Officer Reynolds joined them at the front. Since then, our arrest rates are up, our case clearance is higher, and most importantly, our community trust has improved. Why? Because we learned to value different perspectives instead of fighting them. Chief Richardson added from his seat, our department has become a training site for other precincts. They come to learn how we transformed our culture. It started with one case, but it grew into something much bigger. Andrea smiled, remembering the changes she witnessed. The criminals we caught didn't fail because of superior firepower or fancy technology. They failed because we worked together, combining local knowledge with federal resources, experience with fresh perspectives. A slideshow began behind her, showing images from the case, the evidence boards, the team briefings, the successful arrest. But more importantly, it showed the transformation. Officers from different backgrounds working together, learning from each other, growing stronger as a unit. Last week, Andrea continued, I got a call from that station. Remember Officer Chen? He just made detective, youngest in department history. He told me watching our case taught him that barriers only have power if we believe in them. The cadets leaned forward, completely engaged. This wasn't just another lecture about procedure or protocol. This was a story about real change, about breaking down walls that had stood for generations. But here's what really matters, she said, her voice softening. It's not about one agent, or one department, or even one case. It's about understanding that true strength in law enforcement comes from our differences, not despite them. As the presentation ended, cadets surged forward with questions. But what struck Andrea most was watching Brooks answer them. The same sergeant who had once tried to undermine her now passionately explaining the importance of inclusivity and cooperation in police work. You see that? Chief Richardson said quietly, standing beside her. You didn't just solve a case. You started a movement. These cadets will go to their departments carrying these lessons with them. Later, as the auditorium emptied, Andrea stayed behind with Brooks, Reynolds, and the chief. They stood in a small circle, remembering how far they'd come from those tense first moments at the crime scene. You know what's funny? Brooks mused. We thought we were just solving a case. Turns out we were building a blueprint for the future of law enforcement. Andrea looked at her former colleagues, now friends, and smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. All it takes is one person willing to stand their ground and another willing to learn. As they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, Andrea felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The case had been solved months ago, but its real impact was still unfolding. One mind, one department, one change at a time.